Charger Astro Tarasata Srimad, His Divine Grace of High Charana, Ravinda Bhaktivinoda Swami Prabhupada, ISKCON, BBT Founder Charger, Save the Whole World, Srila Prabhupada, Jai Nitya Vishnu Vishnupad, Paramahansa, Parivra Jagacharya, Astro Tarasata Srimad, His Divine Grace, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj, Ananta Koti Vaishnavinda Ki, Namacharya, Srila Rastakur, Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Hari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Ki Sri Sri Radha Krishna Go Gopinath Shama Kund Radha Kund Giri Govardhana Ki Braj Bhumi Shivandama Dama Ki Navadip Mayapur Dama Ki Purushtam Chatra Jagapur Dama Ki Gangamai Ki Jamuna Mai Ki Bhakti Devi Ki Tulasi Maharani Ki Samaveta Bhaktivinoda ki. Jai Nitai Gaur Premanandi. All glories to some glories. All glories to some glories. All glories to some glories. All glories, Lord, to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Sri Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Yada Rahitam Atmanam. Yada Rahitam Atmanam. Yada Rahitam Atmanam. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Yadarahitam Atmanam. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Swarupena Mayopetam. Swarupena Mayopetam. Swarupena Mayopetam. Pashyan Swarajan Richati. Pashyan Swarajam Richati. Pashyan Swarajam Richati. Swarupena Mayopetam. Pashyan Swarajam Richati. Yadarahitam Atmanam. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Swarupena Mayopetam. Pashyan Swarajam Richati. Yadarahitam Atmanam. Bhutendriya Gunashayai. Swarupena Mayopetam. Pashyan Swarajam Richati. Yada. When. Rahitam. Freed from. Atmanam. Self. Bhuta. Material elements. Indriya. Material senses. Guna ashai. Under the influence of the material modes of nature. Swarupena. In pure existence. Maya. By me. Upetam. Approaching. Pashyan. By seeing. Swarajyam. Spiritual kingdom. Richati. Enjoy. Translation. When you are free from the conception of gross and subtle bodies, and when your senses are freed from all influences of the material modes of the modes of material nature, you will realize your pure form in my association. At that time, you'll be situated in pure consciousness. Responsively, please. When you are freed from the conception of gross and subtle bodies,
when you are free from the conception of gross and subtle bodies,
and when your senses are free,
and when your senses are free
from all influences of the modes of material nature,
from all influences of the modes of material nature,
you will realize your pure form.
You will realize your pure form.
In my association.
In my association.
At that time.
At that time.
You will be situated in pure consciousness.
You will be situated in pure consciousness.
Purport. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, it is said that a person whose only desire is to render transcendental loving service to the Lord is a free person in any condition of material existence. That service attitude is the Swarupa, or real form of the living entity. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in the Chaitanya Charitamrita also confirms this statement by declaring that the real spiritual form of the living entity is eternal servitorship to the Supreme Lord. There's a nice verse there, it's Jivera Swarupa Hoy Krishnana Nityadas Krishnana Tatasti Shakti Bed Abed Prakash. Where Lord Chaitanya is explaining that he says, the same word he's using here, this Swarup. Rup means like form, and Swa means your own, or indicating original form. So this is Jivera, of the Jiva, Sarupa Hoy, Krishnana Nityadas, so Krishnana meaning of Krishna, Nityadas, you're a eternal servant of Krishna. And then he goes on to explain Krishnana Tatasta Shakti Veda Ved Prakash. That the Jiva is actually Tatasta Shakti, which means a manifestation simultaneously different but not different from Krishna. So it's quite an interesting position, because in that position, when one takes on the role of an enjoyer of this material nature, then Tatasta has a really interesting position because it's situated between matter and spirit. It's in the middle, and it can go either way. It can be influenced either way. It kind of reminds me, like, I don't know if you I remember when I first moved to Queensland, I don't know, about 40 years ago, that I came across this, because they never had these fruits down in Victoria. I don't remember having them anyhow, but we experienced up here this fruit called, it's not fruit, it's a vegetable called a choco. Yeah? And chocos are really interesting. Whatever you cook them with, they'll take on that taste. Yeah? They don't have much of a taste of their own. You cook them with a pumpkin, they taste like pumpkin. You cook them with a pear, they taste like a pear. Yeah? And so the jiva is like that. It's got this tatasta position. So, chocos are like tatasta, whatever you put them with, they take on that. So the jiva has this position that if we gravitate towards material nature, then that's what we look like. And for all intents and purposes, we think we're matter. We think we're this body. We think we're the controller. We think the enjoyer. But this is just a covering, because the material nature works so perfectly. And so, like they talk with computers and things about how things work seamlessly. But I've never come across a computer that works seamlessly. They've always got so many problems, I feel like throwing them in the bin half the time. But the material nature is actually seamless. It's so seamless, you can't see it. You're not aware. And Prabhupada often uses the analogy, like, how we're going through all these different changes in life. He uses the analogy of a film. It's a little bit different now because I don't use film so much anymore. But with a film, if you actually look at a film, I can't remember the frame rate, but I think in Australia the frame rate was 60 frames per second. In the US it's 50 frames per second. But if you actually look at a strip of film, there's actually all these little photographs, and each one changes a little bit as you go along. But it's because of the way it runs, it just looks like a continuous action. So in the same way, if you look at the way we're interacting, or we're situated in this material body and interacting with the modes of material nature, the jiva is situated in the region of the heart, but separate from this body. And this is the point that Lord Chaitanya makes. The jiva is actually separate from this material body. It's not the material body. But because of the way the material nature seamlessly interacts, you cannot distinguish between the self and matter. And you're completely caught up in it, and you think you're actually the controller and the enjoyer. But actually, you're not this body. And this is the point that has been gotten to in this verse here, is you're only going to get to that point of understanding that you're not the material body is when you overcome the influence of the gross and subtle material bodies. It sounds easy when it rolls off the tongue, rolls off really nicely, but actually to manifest that, to manifest that awareness of I'm not this gross body, I'm not this subtle body. Because the thing is, just to give you an idea I was talking with someone the other day about this. It's like, you know, when you know you're in a situation in this material world where you start to feel you're enjoying, yeah? You identify with the body because I'm enjoying, but actually it's not the body that's enjoying. The body's, it's just like, you know, I've got this thing here, this glasses case. How can I say that's enjoying? Where's the pleasure this thing experiences? It has a function. You put glasses in it, you know, and you close the lid, and that it protects your glass from getting crushed. That's all it does. How does it enjoy it? It can't, because it's matter. There's no exchange, there's no relationship, there's no rasa associated with this. You know, you could lick it, but it doesn't taste very nice. You could try to enjoy it with your senses, but it's just an object. So the idea is that we need to see in the same way that our body is just an object. It's just a material object. It's matter. And you know, if you've ever seen a dead body, you get the sense of, well, it's just matter. You know, it's because it doesn't function in any way. And why doesn't it function? Is because the living entity, the jiva, has been removed from that machine. It's just like, you know, many of you came here in cars. You look at the car, it's just sitting out there, it's an inanimate object. It will not move. I mean, as long as the handbrake's on and it's in park, you know, because you're on a hill here. It will not move until there's some catalyst, until something's put into that machine which causes it to move. And in the case of a car, that's a jiva. And we see that Krishna in the Gita, he refers to this body, he says yantra rudrani maya. He refers to it as yantra. Yantra means machine. You know? So the body is just a machine. And the machine will not function until there's input from a jiva. But the way the material nature interacts, you know, it's just like, sometimes she's called Durga. So Durga has different meanings, but one of the meanings of Durga is prison house. Now, I don't know where the prison house is these days in Brisbane. I remember it used to be in Boggle Road. And you know, it was big high walls, and you knew it was a prison, you know, and guards and, you know, watchtowers and barbed wire and spotlights and the whole thing, you know, guys walking up and down with machine guns. You know, those guys really meant business, you know, they just walk around with their guns all day long. But you know, you can see, like, you know, for someone to get out of that situation, very, very difficult. And you know that most of the people who are there want to get out. They want to sort of go somewhere else. But the material world's a little bit different, because this word Durga means prison house. But it's such an interesting prison house, nobody wants to leave. Everyone wants to stay here. They think it's such a wonderful place because I can control, I can enjoy, I can be the master. You know, I can be the master of all I survey. But you know, this is just the workings of the material nature, because it's not actually like that. If one has a little bit of intelligence, and if you analyze the situation in this material world, you can see it's a very, very difficult situation, and people are suffering very grievously. And it's kind of interesting. When at the beginning of last year, you know, March, I think it was, April, when COVID started to happen, I was watching posts on social media, and you know, they made this connection between COVID-19 and killing animals, you know, meat markets and things like that. It was a very, very plain, obvious connection. And then there was all these posts going up on social media, how people were saying, oh, that's, you know, I'm going to give up eating meat. I'm going to become vegetarian because, you know, this is causing so much suffering to the animals, so much disease, etc., etc., etc. But how many people actually became vegetarian as a result? How many people, when they were seeing the suffering in this material world, and you know, you're reading posts like that, and it's like in the Veda, or not the Veda, sorry, I can't remember where Prabhupada quotes it from, but he talks about this smasam vairagya. You know, you familiar with this term? Yes. Yeah. So smasa means the crematorium. I mean, you go to the crematorium, like everyone's thinking, they're seeing the bodies being burnt, they're seeing all this sort of stuff, and they think, oh, you know, so much suffering in this material world, I should just give this all up and become a renunciate. And as long as they're at the crematorium, they feel like that. But as soon as they leave, you know, it's like, you know, tomorrow is a very significant day in Australian history. Right? I mean, having grown up in Australia, it's like, you know, it's an embarrassment, to tell you the truth. Yeah. Is this a significant day in one sense, but it's an embarrassment because what are these guys that, and you see, I actually remember we did a play at school, and I can't remember what the play is called. It was an Australian play, and it was about this young man struggling with his identity as an Australian, and his father was a returned soldier, and just like seeing how the Anzacs would kind of celebrate this day, in the great Australian tradition of they go on the parade with all the medals pinned on their chest and stuff like that, and then after the parade they go down to the pub and just get completely blotto, and then fall in the gutter on their face, just rolling drunk, and so the same thing is they have this kind of lamentation, that this reflection about the horror of war and stuff like that, and how do they deal with it? They become intoxicated. They just lose all sense, all intelligence, just through this intoxication. So because the jiva is not particularly gifted with intelligence, especially the conditioned living entity, because they're conditioned by the modes of material nature, and the modes of material nature force them. This is described really nicely in the third chapter of the Gita, verse 5, where it says, what's the verse? The Sanskrit? I remember the verse. Karite Kavaca Sava Prakriti Jayaguna. I can't remember the whole verse, but anyhow, the point is that the Krishna is explaining to Arjuna is that according to the conditioning you receive from the material nature, you're forced to act. And he says chanam. He says not even for a moment can you stop from acting in that way. So if you have a particular conditioning that forces you to act like a dog, it's the same jiva in the dog that is in you and me. Same quality. But do we ever see the dog sort of stop and reflect for a moment? Why am I here? What am I doing in this body? Why am I running around, doing doggy things? They never reflect like that. Why? Because they're driven by material nature. They're forced by material nature to act in a particular way. And that's the situation of all jivas in this world, is they're forced to act. And it's only when one comes to this point. I was having this discussion the other day with, I don't know if any of you know Prabhu. He's the GBC for UK and Ireland and Sweden and a few other places. But we were talking about this verse in the third canto, this passage. I think it's called the movements of the living entity with the material nature. So chapter 33, I think. Anyhow, so in that chapter, the Lord talks about the jiva, how when the jiva's in the soul, so the jiva's in the womb, and the jiva sometimes reflects on its position of how I'm in this difficult situation, and if I get out of this situation, I'll remember you, my Lord. But actually, in the verse it says, the fortunate living entity. And we see the same point is made there in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It says, Brahmanda Brahmadikona Bhagyavana Jeev. So this Bhagyavana Jeev, the fortunate living entity, Guru Krishna Kripa Poi Bhakti Lata Bij. So it says Brahmanda Brahmada. Brahmanda means the universe. And Brahmate, they're wandering, they're up and down through all these different universes. Kona Bhagyavana Jeev. So the Jiva, the living entity, Bhagyavan, who's very fortunate. By the mercy of Krishna, it says, Guru Krishna Kripa Poi Bhakti Lata Bij. By the mercy of Krishna, he'll come into contact with a spiritual master or spiritual guide, someone who can give you divya gyan, someone who can give you knowledge of the process of bhakti. And then by the mercy of Guru, when you receive that person, that connection, then by the mercy of Guru, one receives Krishna. But the point is there, is one who's very fortunate. We need to understand the fact that we've come into this situation because, I was just in town yesterday. I was going over to see Mahamantra, and I was just in town. I was just sitting down having a juice and just like watching. I like to go to those places and observe people, and you just think, they're so caught up. There was some kind of function in the mall there where they were giving out gold medals to these school kids who had won some sports event or something like that, and they're just so caught up in the whole thing. They think that this is life. They think this is the sum and bonum of everything. Is I've won this sports competition, or young girl, young boy, growing up to be very handsome, attractive, get married, have kids, go through, get old, die, they die, the whole cycle just goes on and on. And they think that's everything. They don't actually think there's anything beyond that. And this is just like animal civilization, cat and dog civilization. They're just going to eat, sleep, mate and defend. That's all they do. Same thing. And it mentions those 6 changes there in the scriptures about how you're born, you grow, you produce byproducts, you wane, you dwindle, you vanish. Every living thing goes through the same cycle. But one who's intelligent looks at that and they can see, what's the point of this? Why am I here? And this, Sanatana Goswami, he makes that same point. That, he says, Kayami, who am I? What am I doing here? Why am I forced to suffer these threefold miseries? Only an intelligent person actually has that reflection. You look at most people in this material world, do they think like that? Do they think, why am I here in this material world? Why am I suffering? Most people don't even connect that they're suffering, or they feel some suffering and they'll immediately take shelter of some kind of intoxication. I mean, how many people in this day and age are on drugs for depression? And this is kind of interesting because, like Lord Brahmā here, he's suffering depression, because if you look back in the 8th chapter, the previous chapter, he appeared on the lotus, and he couldn't understand anything. He was just completely bewildered. It mentions he was in ignorance. Now we know from ignorance comes madness. Prior to that is depression and things like that. So he was in ignorance, and he was looking all around, and he couldn't see anything. So he went down into the lotus. He could see the lotus he was sitting on. He could see the stem, and he could see the lake. He couldn't see Vishnu or anything like that. It was all. So he went down into the lotus for 100 years. He went down to the lotus, and then when his time had come, can you imagine, he's traveling down for 100 years and he couldn't get to the end of it. How long is the stem of that lotus? And how vast is Mahavishnu, or Garbhodakshaya Vishnu? And so he couldn't trace out the end of it. Then he came back up and he sat on the lotus and he started to reflect. He started to, and it describes there, actually later in this chapter, the Lord describes how he manifested himself internally in Brahmā, so Brahmā could actually understand. But Brahmā was feeling anxiety, he was feeling depression, and he didn't take any drugs to deal with it. Like you look in this day and age, people are so pilled out. You try to have a conversation with them, you're kind of like, the brain's like in reverse practically. They're just so slow. And I've even seen it with devotees. They're just completely drugged out, dealing with the depression. But the solution is the process of Krishna consciousness. It's the only way you're going to overcome any material difficulty in this world is through engaging in the practice of Krishna consciousness. Because what's happening is why we're experiencing these difficulties is because of this identification with the material body. Of course, I'm not suggesting if someone has some serious mental issues, they should just take shelter chanting Hare Krishna and everything will be okay. Because we've seen it doesn't actually, really pan out that way, because it really depends on one's ability to take shelter of the holy name. And as we see it's pointing out here, Krishna is saying when you're free from the conception of gross and subtle bodies, just because we're chanting Hare Krishna doesn't mean we become free from the conception of gross and subtle body. It's not. It can be that easy, but generally we see it's not. If one's able to absorb themselves completely in the holy name and take full shelter of the process, then yes, they will come to that stage very rapidly. This is mentioned in so many different places, and we see, there's many examples of that. For instance, you look at, I think it was Katvanga Maharaj, is described, is it the 9th canto, it's described Katvanga Maharaj, where he was fighting for the demigods for many thousands of years, and then when they were successful, the Devatas asked him if he wanted a benediction, and he just said, I want to know how long I've got to live, because then I can plan out my spiritual journey. And they told him, you have but a few moments to live. And so immediately he just renounced everything and just took shelter of Krishna. So it's possible, you can do it. But then keep in mind, that Katvanga Maharaj was not an ordinary person you're going to see walking down Queen Street Mall or something like that. He's quite an elevated, powerful personality, so he was able to just let go of everything completely and surrender to Krishna. And here also the other point it's making, that when you become free from the modes of material nature. So this brought to mind, there's two really interesting verses in the Bhagavad Gita, that one's from the 7th chapter, one's from the 4th chapter. Yesham Vitaraga Bhaya Kroda Mamaya Mavashita. Bahavo, is it Bahavo? Gyana-tapasa Bhutamad? No, I think I'm mixing up two verses. But anyhow, so Krishna's pointing out to Arjuna being freed from, where are we? I'm just seeing. Sorry, my memory's not so good on these things. Yeah. Bahavo Gyana-tapasa Bhutamad Bhavam Agataha. Being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me, and taking refuge in me, many persons of the past became purified by knowledge of me, and thus they all attained transcendental love for me. So Krishna is explaining this to Arjuna in the 4th chapter, that through the process of bhakti, by engaging in the process of bhakti, you become free from attachment, fear, anger, become absorbed in me, you take refuge in me, and you become purified by this knowledge of me. And the other verse that I was thinking of is Yesham Twanta, is 7:28. Yesham Twanta Katam Papam Gyananam Punyakaranam. I'm really having a good time with this slogas today. Te Dvandva Te Dvandva Mohani Mukta Bhajate Mamdrita Vritaha. The persons who acted piously in the previous life and in this life, and whose simple actions are completely eradicated, are freed from the dualities of delusion. Same point that he's making here. You become free from all this influence of material nature, become free from all these dualities of delusion, and then they engage themselves in my service with determination. So, this is something I've been reflecting on a little bit over the past few months. Is I find that my determination in bhakti is not what I think it needs to be. And then so when we read verses like this, we can see, because I'm kind of thinking like how to become more determined, how to become more focused in bhakti. But the key is given here, is we have to become free from, you have to give up sinful activities completely, and that even means mental or whatever, and becoming free from dualities of delusion. But being situated in this material world, that's not an easy thing to do, because we're just confronted constantly with duality. Heat, cold, birth, death, night, day. And because of our situation in this material body, we identify with that. It's just like, I'm feeling quite cold right now. And that's why I've got, quite a few layers of clothes on. So I'm identifying with duality. At night time I can't see it, daytime I can see okay. So this is the duality that's affecting me. And because we identify with that, then it's very, very hard to become fixed in the process of bhakti. But as Krishna points out, as Srila Prabhupada points out, you just keep applying yourself to the process of bhakti, and gradually these things are modified. Gradually we become more steady in our devotional service. I'll just read the rest. It's a long purport. I'll try and read the rest of it. The Mayavad school shudders at the thought of a service attitude in a living entity, not knowing that in the transcendental world, the service of the Lord is based on transcendental love. And that's the situation of everyone in this material world. If someone asks you who you are, and you say, I'm a servant, the whole idea of being a servant is repulsive to them. They think this is like the lowest of the low. This is the lowest people in society. They do service type of things. But I want to be the master. I want to be the controller. Transcendental loving service is never to be compared to the forced service of the material world. So that's the thing. In the material world, it's forced service. You're forced into that situation because you can't do anything else. You're forced to be a slave or whatever. But in the spiritual realm, you're doing it because it's the most attractive thing to you. It's something you're doing out of love. In the material world, even if one is under the conception that he is no one's servant, he is still the servant of his senses, under the dictation of the material modes. Factually, No one is a master here in the material world, and therefore the servants of the senses have a very bad experience in servitude. I like the way Prabhupada writes that. They shudder at the thought of service because they have no knowledge of the transcendental position. In the transcendental loving service, the servitor is as free as the Lord. The Lord is Swarat, or fully independent, and the servant is also fully independent, or Swarat, in the spiritual atmosphere, because there is no forced service. There, the transcendental loving service is due to spontaneous love. A reflected glimpse of such service is experienced in the service of the mother unto the son, the friend's service unto the friend, the wife's service unto the husband. These reflections of service by friends, parents, or wives are not forced, but are due only to love. Here in this material world, however, the loving service is only a reflection. The real service, or service in Swarup, is present in the transcendental world in association with the Lord. The very same service in transcendental love can be practiced in devotion here. So Prabhupada's pointing out here that even though you're only going to experience that real relationship of service in the spiritual world, you can practice that here through the process of bhakti. This verse is also applicable to the Jnani school. The unenlightened Jnani, when freed from all material contaminations, namely the gross and subtle bodies, together with the senses of the material modes of nature, is placed in the Supreme and is thus liberated from material bondage. The Jnanis and the devotees are actually in agreement up to the point of liberation from material contamination. But whereas the Jnanis remain pacified on the platform of simple understanding, the devotees further develop spiritual advancement in loving service. The devotees develop a spiritual individuality in their spontaneous service attitude, which is enhanced on and on up to the point of Madhurya Ras, or transcendental loving service, reciprocated between the lover and the beloved. And I thought this last sentence was really interesting. I mean, I don't particularly feel overly qualified to comment on it, but it mentions here that the devotees develop the devotees develop a spiritual individuality in their spontaneous service attitude. And of course, we see, like in the beginning stages of bhakti, we apply ourselves to what they call the process, or vidimar, where it's all following rules and regulations. We all do the same thing. We all attend the same program. We all, it's kind of like, it's almost like we're all kind of like little stereotypes in a sense. We're all doing exactly the same thing, jumping up and down in kirtan, chanting 16 rounds, etc., etc. But as one evolves in spiritual life, as this Bhutamad, Bhagavatam, as these material contaminations are removed, then the individual spirit soul starts to become more and more apparent. Because right now what we're interacting with, Prabhupada mentions this in a purport, I think it's in the beginning of the second canto, where what's happening in the material world is we're just interacting with the different aspects of material nature. We're not interacting with the pure spirit soul. We're interacting with the covering, which then, this covering causes us to act, depending on how the different modes of nature, there's the goodness, passion, ignorance, how they're combined within each jiva to shape this living entity, or what appears to be the living entity. So essentially that's what we interact with. One person may be more tamasic, one person may be more rajasic, more sattvic, but that's what you're interacting with the modes of nature. But then as this contamination becomes removed through the process of bhakti, through contact with the transcendental reality, then the pure spirit soul becomes more revealed. And as Prabhupada is saying here, it goes on and on and on up to the point of Madhurya Ras. And this all develops through this process of bhakti. And also I found it very interesting here, like verse 32, 3, 4, I think up to verse 36, is it? I can't remember. Maybe it's... Anyhow, these verses are in verse 35, there it is, yeah. It's almost the same as the Chapter Sloki back in the second canto, I think second canto, chapter 9, 33 to 36. where the Lord is offering the same guidance to Brahma. And then even we see here in verse 35, he says, "You are the original Rishi, and because your mind is always fixed on me, even though you will be engaged in generating various progeny, the vicious mode of passion will never encroach upon you." This is practically the same as verse 37, the verse immediately after chapter 30. So it seems like, and here we see, I think it was in yesterday's verse, it was saying that, it wasn't yesterday's verse, anyway, maybe it's one of the verses coming up, where Krishna says to Brahma, he says, but this has already been done. I've already given you this benediction before. So we can see this is happening again, where Krishna's given Brahma this guidance, and he's saying, don't worry about it. You've already been through this before. And then we can see, and this is discussed in a later purport also, that because Brahma's position as a great, especially our Brahma, is a great pure devotee of Krishna, that these things that are happening to him are not the influence of the modes of material nature. Even though he's acting, just like we see with Arjuna, acting like he was under the influence of the modes of material nature, in Yudhisthira, Kurukshetra, and so many different examples we can see there. But because of Brahma's position as a great pure devotee of the Lord, then we can understand that this is actually being dictated or being arranged by the internal potency of the Lord, by his yogamaya potency, for the purpose of pastime, for the purpose of demonstrating how one needs to take shelter of Krishna to achieve the goal of life. And I remember that these prayers are particularly interesting. We see basically from verse 1 of this chapter up to verse 25, these are the prayers of Lord Brahma for creative energy. And then I think from probably about verse 30, 31, something like that, to the end of this chapter, is Krishna is giving instructions to Brahma. But these and then really interesting, if you look in the I remember years ago, did anyone ever meet Mahavishnu Goswami? I think he came here a few times, right? Yeah. He came here, right? He was a very extraordinary devotee. And one of the things that Maharaj was well known for was slokas, especially Bhagavatam slokas. He could chant sloka after sloka, actually whole chapters of slokas. And he told me years ago, he said, you should learn these creative prayers of Lord Brahma. 25. When I looked at 25 verses, I thought, no, I'll never do that. But then, if we look here, just like a preview of what's coming. We see in verse 38, Krishna says, "O Brahma, the prayers that you have chanted praising the glories of my transcendental activities, the penances you have undertaken to understand me, and your firm faith in me, all these are to be considered my causeless mercy." Right? And then in verse 40, he says, any human being, I'll say 31 too. I am very much pleased by your description of me in terms of my transcendental qualities, which appear mundane to the mundaners. I grant you all benedictions in your desire to glorify all the planets by your activities. So he's saying, I'm really pleased by this. I like this, what you've said. Then in verse 40, here's the punchline. Any human being who prays like Brahma and who thus worships me shall very soon be blessed with the fulfillment of all his desires, for I am the Lord of all benedictions. So now I understand why Maharaj was telling me to learn these verses. Because Krishna is saying here, if you learn these prayers, if you pray like Lord Brahma prayed, then I'll fulfill all your desires, because I'm the Lord of all benedictions. So these 26 verses, very, very important verses, 25 verses, 1 through to 25. Very important verses. And we see that in the beginning, Brahma, he starts talking about how people are struggling in this material world. Then he talks about the benefit, devotees get, or how devotees are well situated. Then he glorifies Krishna, and then he asks, as Madhavi was pointing out yesterday, there's 4 verses there where he's asking specific benedictions from Krishna, 22, 3, 4, 5. He's asking specific benedictions from Krishna. And it's interesting, the last verse, 25, So Sava Bhagavatam. This is a verse that the devotees chant when they wake the deities in the morning and the afternoon. As you're asking, dear Lord, please open your eyes and glance upon me, and that thus, benedict me with your auspicious glance. So very, very interesting section of the Bhagavatam. I think every section of the Bhagavatam is very interesting, but this is also quite interesting. Any questions at all on that? Nice to see you, Matsubu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Vanmali Krishna Das speaking. Dhanavad Pranam to all the Vaishnavas and all of you. I just wanted to share my realization really. Realization is that there is a checkmate situation created by the material world for all the souls of our Brahmā and everything. But what needs to happen, that checkmate situation is overcome by this service swarat root of the devotee's service, voluntary service. And that is what my realization is. Really, it's a beautiful analogy. I thought I must share it with you. The checkmate situation of material world, the slavery situation, is overcome by the independent swarat service attitude of the devotee. And this is what has been dictated to us by our parampara and advised by parampara. And now all the Brahma Samhita, Bhagavad Gita, so the Bhagavatam, also the nectar of devotion, nectar of instruction, nectar of so many literature which Prabhupada himself is part of that whole thing. We are all meant to be in service to Prabhupada's dictation all the way through. Thank you very, very much. That is my realization.
Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
So, any other questions, comments? Okay. Thank you very much for Prabhupada ki, Samaveta Bhaktivinoda ki, Jai Gopenandi.
Krishna, Prabhu.